You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
George Harrison never raised his voice. He rarely lashed out in interviews. And yet, within the Beatles, he carried a quiet bitterness that grew darker with time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public, but it was real. And it was personal. Hidden beneath his meditative calm and spiritual pursuits was a grudge that never fully healed. The silent underdog. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They shared chords, traded records, and bonded over a love of skiffle and rock and roll. McCartney was older, sharper, and more assertive. George, quiet and impressionable, was drawn to Paul's confidence, and later to John Lennon's brilliance. When he joined Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15. Lennon initially thought he was too young. McCartney had to arrange a second audition on a bus where George impressed John by playing the lead guitar line from Ranchi. That moment opened the door to what would become the most famous band in history. But even from the start, George Harrison was walking into someone else's story. Lennon and McCartney dominated the band's early identity. They were the primary songwriters. They crafted the vision. George followed. He learned. He absorbed. And for a while, that was enough. As the Beatles skyrocketed to fame, Harrison earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle. In part, it was the press romanticizing his introversion. But to those closest to him, it was something heavier, a man who was beginning to feel sidelined, even suffocated. He had musical ideas. He had spiritual awakenings. But in the studio, his voice was too often drowned out. When he proposed songs, they were passed over. When he offered guitar arrangements, they were second-guessed. Paul, especially, ever the perfectionist, had a way of taking over. George would later say, "He ruined me as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from years of being subtly undermined." The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just dominant. It was an empire within a band. George wasn't just left out, he was left behind. And as the group evolved, the frustration within him began to harden. What had started as admiration slowly warped into resentment, and no one stoked that fire more than Paul McCartney. The breaking point in the studio came by the time the Beatles began working on the White Album in 1968. George Harrison was no longer content with being the silent contributor. He had grown as a songwriter, both in confidence and ambition. But inside the studio, things were growing increasingly tense. The dynamic had shifted. Paul McCartney, driven and detail-obsessed, had taken on a de facto leadership role. John Lennon, often distracted by his new relationship with Yoko Ono, was growing more erratic. And George, he was done being overlooked. The sessions for Let It Be in early 1969 exposed the cracks that had been building for years. Cameras rolled as the band tried to rehearse, but what they captured was less collaboration and more quiet collapse. One infamous moment between George and Paul was caught on tape. Paul was trying to direct Harrison's guitar part on the song Two of Us. Frustrated, George pushed back with a calm but cutting line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It wasn't sarcasm. It was resignation, a subtle white flag that said, "I'm not here to fight you, but I'm tired of this." To the outside world, it may have seemed like a minor disagreement. But to those in the room, it was the culmination of years of artistic suffocation. Engineer Glenn Johns, who witnessed the Let It Be sessions firsthand, later described the atmosphere as very unpleasant. The creative process had become a battlefield, and George, no longer willing to suppress his frustration, temporarily quit the band on January 10, 1969. What made it worse was that Paul didn't seem to understand the weight of what he was doing. He wasn't cruel, just controlling. McCartney had a vision, and he wanted everyone to follow it, even if it meant steamrolling their ideas. George had finally reached his limit. After returning to the band a few days later under new terms, he began working on songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, masterpieces that proved what he was capable of when he was simply left alone. But the damage wasn't undone. The rift between George and Paul had widened into something more permanent. And while George may have returned to the band, a part of him had already moved on. When friendship turned cold, the Beatles officially broke up in 1970. But for George Harrison, the split wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. While the media focused on the feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison was quietly cutting his own emotional ties, especially with Paul. The public saw polite interviews and staged reunions, but behind the scenes, George was struggling to let go of the resentment that had been building for years. In 1971, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been rejected or sidelined during his time with the Beatles. It was a creative and commercial triumph, and it didn't go unnoticed by his former bandmates. One track in particular, Wah Wah, stood out. On the surface, it sounded upbeat, but lyrically it was biting. The title was a metaphor for the emotional noise and frustration George endured, and many interpreted the song as a thinly veiled jab at Paul McCartney's domineering behavior during their final years as a group. The bitterness didn't stop there. In 1973, Harrison released Sue My Sue You Blues, another pointed commentary, this time about the legal battles that followed the breakup. While the song addressed the group as a whole, it was clear that much of his frustration was aimed at McCartney, who had initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. That move, while necessary, felt like betrayal to Harrison. Not just because of the court drama, but because it cemented how far apart they had grown. Even Harrison's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later said that George never truly liked Paul's personality. She described how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger, overwhelmed by the constant arguments, especially with Paul. They tolerated each other, she said. But I don't think they really loved each other. Professionally, they made brief attempts to work together again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles reunited for the Anthology project, but even then, old habits resurfaced. George still found Paul difficult. In private, he would roll his eyes at McCartney's suggestions, and Paul, ever the diplomat, in public, admitted they still got on each other's nerves. Time had passed, but the wounds hadn't really healed. By the mid-1970s, George Harrison had already carved out a successful solo career, but the scars from his Beatles years still lingered, especially when it came to Paul McCartney. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George spoke candidly about something few had heard him admit aloud: "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. He ruined me as a guitar player." It was a devastating statement, quiet but sharp. Coming from a man revered for his guitar work on songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the comment revealed how psychologically damaging those years under McCartney's influence had been. George wasn't saying Paul had done it maliciously. What he meant was that the years of being overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had drained him of creative confidence. He'd spent too much time playing what someone else wanted, and too little time being heard on his own terms. This internal conflict didn't just affect his playing, it affected how he viewed collaboration. In the same period, George confessed he would gladly join a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. "Paul is a fine bass player," he said, "but he's a bit overpowering at times." That wasn't a slight. It was the reality of working with someone whose perfectionism often meant control. For Harrison, the issue wasn't just music. It was about space, about being allowed to grow. And inside the Beatles there had been very little space left for him. That realization, painful and quiet, followed him long after the applause had faded. Lennon, the wound that never closed. While George Harrison's frustrations with Paul McCartney were more visible, his relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complex and in many ways more painful. In the early years of the Beatles, Harrison idolized Lennon. John was older, sharp-witted, and fearless. George saw him not just as a bandmate, but as a mentor. Lennon, alongside McCartney, had helped shape Harrison's early songwriting, even encouraging him to experiment with structure and lyricism. That sense of closeness, however, began to erode as the years passed. As Lennon became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, George found himself emotionally shut out. John, who once took pride in his bond with George, grew distant, and unlike McCartney's dominating studio presence, Lennon's indifference cut in a different way. He mocked Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality, treating it with sarcasm rather than curiosity. It hurt. George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way to find peace and identity. But from Lennon, he received little more than eye rolls. The true depth of their estrangement became visible in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. In over 400 pages of personal reflection, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Fans noticed, and it wasn't an accident. The silence was a message in itself. Harrison later admitted that John could be a very difficult person and that their final years together were often cold. When Lennon was murdered in December 1980, the shock rattled George to his core. But even then, his tribute was not full of nostalgia or sentimentality. Instead, Harrison expressed his grief through music all those years ago, a song that was both homage and subtle reckoning. It remembered the early bond, yes, but it didn't pretend the pain had never happened. In later interviews, Harrison spoke more softly about Lennon. Age and distance had allowed him to reflect. He acknowledged John's genius and their complicated history, but the emotional scar never really faded. For Harrison, Lennon was someone he had once followed blindly and someone who had later made him feel invisible. That kind of wound doesn't heal easily, even with time. As the 1990s came to a close, George Harrison had largely stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, at least in public. He was no longer the young guitarist fighting for space on an album. By then he had become a respected solo artist, a quiet philanthropist, and a spiritual thinker. Yet, despite his peaceful exterior, the emotional residue from his years with the Beatles still lingered. Harrison rarely talked about the band unless prompted. When he did, his tone was dry, reflective, and often tinged with irony. He didn't romanticize the past. He told the truth, or at least his version of it. In one interview, when asked if he missed being in the Beatles, he replied, "Not with the others, no." That remark, while humorous on the surface, revealed just how deep the wounds went. In 1994, George reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles anthology project. It was a media sensation. For the first time since their split, the surviving members were back in the same room working on music together, completing John Lennon's unfinished demos. Free as a bird and real love. To fans, it was a moment of healing. But insiders saw a different story. Old dynamics quickly returned. George bristled under Paul's direction. When asked in an interview how it felt to be back in the studio with McCartney, Harrison replied, "It was like going back to school." Producer Jeff Lynne, who had worked with George in the Traveling Wilburys and helped produce the anthology recordings, later recalled how George rolled his eyes whenever Paul got too controlling. McCartney, to his credit, later admitted that the old patterns never really disappeared. "We got on each other's nerves, but we got through it." By 1997, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. He received radiation treatment and briefly went into remission, but the disease returned, this time in his lungs and brain. During these final years, he lived mostly out of the public eye, spending time with his wife Olivia and son Darnie at their home in Friar Park, a sprawling Victorian estate in Henley-on-Thames. Even in the face of illness, George's wit remained intact. In a 2001 Yahoo online chat, one of his last public appearances, he was asked, "Does Paul still annoy you?" George didn't answer directly. Instead, he quoted an old Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was vintage Harrison, philosophical, elegant, but unmistakably pointed. As his condition worsened, Harrison was visited by old friends. One of them was Paul McCartney. The meeting was quiet and personal. Paul later described how they sat together holding hands, a gesture neither would have made in their younger years. "He was my baby brother," Paul said in a 2008 interview. "We joked. We talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." George Harrison died on November 29, 2001 at a friend's home in Los Angeles, surrounded by his loved ones. His final words, according to Olivia, were simple: "Love one another." But even in death, the complexities of his relationships remained. While Paul grieved publicly and spoke warmly of George in interviews, the unspoken tension between them had never fully dissolved. The forgiveness, if it came, was quiet, incomplete, and perhaps one-sided. George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion. He had never been the loudest Beatle, but his pain was real, and his silence spoke volumes. Through the decades, there had been admiration, there had been love, but there had also been bitterness. And in the end, there were some people George Harrison simply could never fully forgive. Do you think George and Paul ever truly made peace before George passed away? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold music histories.